So we talked about one of the practical things in the world that happened as we ended last week that changed things, and that was the printing press. And it's really hard to overstate how important the printing press was in the church, because when people finally got their hands back on Bibles again and read what was in the Bible, the normal reaction was, "What? What does this have to do with what we're doing?" So it really did. It was another major thing that helped bring about the Reformation. But we talked last week about all of those things that were pretty darn corrupt in the church. Indulgences is one of the things that we'll talk about today. But you see where the church went from being a church where we were eating a meal together in someone's house to a priest holding this monstrance in his hands with gloves that had a consecrated host in the center that people were afraid to do anything but look at. That's a pretty major jump in understanding of what we're doing. So there were a fair number of people that said, something's got to go here, okay? Okay. Let me talk a little bit about England before we get into the Reformations themselves. From the beginning, England was always a mix of cultures coming together. It was Greco-Roman and Celtic and Latin Christianity from Rome, and all of that kind of mixed together, and that helped create some of this stuff that's going to go on in the Reformation. But I really want to say it's important to understand that there were three distinct Reformations, and they were quite different from one another. This is the one that you know about, that we always talk about. Okay, so who was the person mostly connected to this? Okay, and that's good. So the Genevan Reformation, anybody? Yep, there you go. So John Calvin is the main person, as well as Zwingli. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about a person for the English Reformation because there wasn't any person until way, way, way later. So let's just leave it at that, okay? So before the Reformation began, two other interesting things happened in the liturgy. One was kneeling. Kneeling did not occur in the church until right before the Reformational period, in the time that we were talking about last week. And the other was this. The invention of the altar rail came in the 1400s, okay? So that was another thing. We talked about the rood screen last week and the table being against the wall and the priest being behind the screen. The other thing that happened was the altar rail, which was set up to literally separate the clergy from the people. And I'm going to tell you, when I got here at Grace St. Paul's, you can still, if you come up, you can still see the markings of it. There was a gate here, and when we got to the offertory in the church, acolytes would come up and close the gate, and then we would begin the Eucharistic prayer and the offertory part of the church. That is a great symbol for what had happened in the church and what was going on.
I was just thinking that I think it was very, but that still goes on.
Oh yeah.
Yes, I mean in the Episcopal Church as well.
Oh yeah.
Because you don't have one here, I know, but in another one I've gone to in town in other years, It's a very nice church and everything,
Absolutely.
and it's Episcopal, but they come up and close that little metal gate and
Absolutely.
everything you
Yeah,
said.
it happens all the time. Yeah, it's still quite prevalent in the church. So I'll tell you what happened here is I was here the week before I started officially as the priest, and I saw this happen, and I almost passed out. Because this is, Grace St. Paul's was the progressive voice of the Episcopal Church in Arizona, and I was just shocked that we were still using these symbols from before the Reformation. So next week, James unhinged them for me, and then I just came up here and ripped the things right off the hinges and said, we won't ever do this anymore. And if I had my way, we would take out the altar rail altogether. But that is really difficult for a lot of people, and I understand that personal piety, so we haven't messed with that. Now that we're having communion standing up, I'm considering that again, but I also understand that it's very important for some people to live into that piety that they've always understood. So we haven't messed with that. But I would need you to understand the symbol and where this comes from and what that's all about, okay? So that was just another thing, okay? So, so the medieval church was very unified throughout Europe. Canon law was universally accepted in the church. So there were basically two powers in your life, the secular sovereignty and the church, the priestly power. And that's how the world was being run. There was some breakdown going on in this by the 15th century. I'm sure you all know about the Papal Schisms and what was going on. At one point, we had 3 popes at the same time when we were having all these battles through all of that. There was, I would say that the beginning of the Reformations came around 1375. And that was when a philosopher in England named John Wycliffe distinguished the ideal reality of the church from what it had actually become. So he talked about some of these things out loud that we've been talking about. He denied the material in the church. He argues that the Bible is the sole criterion of doctrine to which no ecclesiastical authority can add anything. So it's very Lutheran in the way we came to understand that. And he said the authority of the Pope is ill-founded in Scripture. He can't find any, and if it's there, I'm sure missing it. He denounced the friars and asked the government of England to completely reform the church. He attacked transubstantiation, the idea that something chemical was happening to the elements. He said it encouraged a superstitious attitude towards communion. What a concept there. It got him in a lot of trouble at Oxford, where he was. But a group grew out of his movement called the Lollards, and that all of that was happening in England while the rest of this was going on. Okay, all right. So let's get to the big stuff. So 1517 is when Martin Luther put the 95 Thesis on the Wittenberg Cathedral. Is that the right one? Did I say the right one, Gabi? Okay. And in those 95 so first of all, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. Okay, he was very much entrenched in the church. So in that, he opposed the sale of indulgences to finance the building of St. Peter's in Rome. And he comes up with quickly the statement that you all know quite well, that salvation comes by faith through grace alone, and not through any human merit. And that became kind of the centerpiece of this movement. So, say it again? Sure. Salvation comes by faith through grace alone and not through any human merit. Okay? That you don't earn your way to any sort of salvation, that it comes to you by God's grace alone. His rallying cry became sola scriptura, the Bible only. That's all we need. We don't need any of this other stuff. We don't need. So remember, in the church at the time, you must have a priest to be your mediator between you and God. That's what the sacraments were all about, and you needed the sacraments to get to God, and you needed the priest to be able to do that. And Martin Luther said, "Bull. We don't need we don't need no priest." Okay, so that was obviously a big deal for an Augustinian monk to be saying in that kind of setting. Okay, he encouraged. He supported the vernacular in the liturgy, but he did not forbid Latin in what was going on there. He encouraged congregational participation in the liturgy, because remember what we said, the people were basically just sitting there watching what was happening, and so he tried to change that. He tried to get people to receive communion again, because everybody's afraid to. And so he got people participating in praying and singing hymns and that kind of thing. So, so that's the thought process behind what's going on in that part of the Reformation. In the Genevan Reformation, John Calvin is very much a disciple of Augustine of Hippo. He's very much into double predestination, and the phrase that is associated with John Calvin is the total depravity of man, of humanity. And Calvin pushes for the church to be just about the Word. So what he does is take this and put it in the center of the church, in the front, in the center, and got rid of this, got rid of all the candles, got rid of all the stuff other than the pulpit, and centered the service around the Word. This is all about, so you listen to the Word in the Bible, and then somebody preaches about it, and that's it. And there are many churches today that are focused strictly on the Word, as John Calvin did. Ulrich Zwingli is preaching against the adoration of saints, relics, and the whole system of indulgences. I talked a little bit about indulgences that week. That's the idea that you pay the church, you pay the priest to pray for your family members who have died or for something else, so that they can get a free ticket to heaven. Okay? There were these things called plenary indulgences, and if you got a plenary indulgence, it meant you went straight to heaven, no purgatory, anything else, if you did the right set of prayers and you paid the right priest. Okay? Plenary indulgences, I'm sorry if I'm being pejorative here, but it's really hard for me to say this with a straight face. But plenary indulgences, when I was in the Roman Church, were still a part of the tradition. I did a plenary indulgence prayer every morning when I was a kid. You did that with something else. So Zwingli was the first guy that said that's just ridiculous. He reinstituted the baptism of believers, so they weren't baptizing children, as we talked a little bit about last week, and we'll talk more about later in this. He was denounced by Luther and Zwingli and Calvin in that process, so that was quite interesting too. He eventually wants to eliminate monasteries and all religious images, so that gives you an idea of what he was about. He denounced clerical celibacy, saying there was no biblical reason for that. So there you go. So this is the beginning of what would become the Presbyterian Church. And out of that Presbyterian church comes the Anabaptist tradition, and we'll put all of those together for you later in all of this, okay? All right. In England, they went through the entire Reformation with little change. Kings were still battling for ecclesiastical power. By 1450, the king sent a letter to the Pope and told him who to appoint in all of the clerical positions in the church, and few cases were ever overturned. In the 16th century, England is a highly religious country compared to the rest of the continent. That's very interesting, too, while all of this is going on. But of course, it's a total theocracy. The church intervened in people's lives in every single way. Not much, well, even more so than like in Israel today, or even Afghanistan. It was pretty heavy. But apparently there wasn't much dissatisfaction with religion at that point there. In 1509, Henry VIII comes to the throne, and Lutheranism is hatched during his reign. Lutheranism is a big influence at Cambridge, and it influences this guy at Cambridge named Thomas Cranmer. And those of you with an Episcopal background know who Thomas Cranmer is. We'll get to that. So Henry VIII uses the Lutherans as allies for political purposes, but he never finds any fondness for Reformed doctrine at all. He would have much rather just stayed in the Catholic tradition the way it was. I talked a little bit about the Lollards. There was that was a blue-collar movement in England, and while Lutheranism was a scholarly movement. So, but that's all that's going on in England, was this little blue-collar movement towards the kinds of things that Martin Luther was talking about. Nothing else. Thomas More was enlisted by Henry to refute Lutheran doctrine, in fact, and he wants the reform, but orthodox and spiritual reform only. In the 1520s, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey is the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, and that's when the church gets complete control of church administration in England. Wolsey is Henry's right-hand man. He has incredible power. He's vastly unpopular. But Wolsey shows Henry that church and state could rule as one thing in England. And Henry is obviously quite attracted to that idea. Okay? All right. So we get to the divorce. First of all, remember that the term divorce is not like today's term. A divorce meant an annulment. It still does mean an annulment in the Roman Catholic tradition. So Henry asks for an annulment. And he says the issue for him is that Catherine's former husband was Henry's elder brother, Arthur, and that is not legal in England. That was the case that he argued for this. And of course, he's arguing this with the Pope and asking for him to annul this marriage. Now, what's important to know is that was a day-to-day request for popes, two popes. It happened all the time. I mean, it happened every week. It was a regular occurrence. And if Henry had gotten that annulment, England would have stayed Roman Catholic. But of course, what he got instead was total and complete power. In 1529, Henry looks for a theological argument to convince the Pope. He appoints Thomas Cranmer to do that, who says that his marriage is null and void. And while all that is happening and they're arguing with the Pope, Henry has already secretly married Anne Boleyn. So that's already happened. So all this is going on. Pope Clement finds out that he's remarried already, so Pope Clement excommunicates Henry from the church. Still, there's very little resistance in England about any of this. I guess mostly because nobody backed Catherine to begin with. So by 1534, Henry just keeps going, and that's when the Act of Supremacy is passed, saying that the King of England is the only supreme head of the church. So the Act of Supremacy says the king gets to do everything. So there is no pope for them. Obviously, he's been excommunicated. There can't be. The next thing you need to understand is that nothing changes in the church. Nothing. You go to church the next week, it's the same priest, it's the same liturgy, everything is exactly the same. And so it was still very Catholic. At one point, Henry VIII was called a defender of the Catholic faith. He got an award for it. So there you go. Nothing changed until Henry VIII started running out of money. And then he said, well, we're going to dissolve the monasteries and to get some money. And that's when everybody went totally berserk in England, because that was the centerpiece of faith. So that's what was going on now there. So Henry was followed by Edward VI, the boy, who was just in office for that short period of time, and nothing happened. Thomas Cranmer starts to try to define what Anglicanism is all about, and in 1549, the first Book of Common Prayer comes out, which is the centerpiece of what being Anglican is. Still, not very different than what's going on in the Catholic tradition. They're just not reporting to the Pope. Lady Jane Grey is next. Nothing much happens. Nothing really happens until you get to Mary I. And Mary, that's 1553 that starts. And she brings the church back to Roman Catholicism totally. There was this movement with the Book of Common Prayer to try to separate themselves somewhat. She brings the church back to the Roman Catholic tradition totally and completely. Someone can tell me the pejorative name for Mary that I will not say. Good. Yep, there you go, Bloody Mary. So obviously she's killing everyone who is following this new Protestant kind of tradition that's starting to grow in England and bringing the church totally back to Roman Catholicism. The Church of England is the only religious body in Europe in which the battle between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation has still not yet been decided. Every other country in Europe has picked either one of these or stayed in the Catholic Church. England is still messing around with this all this time. And with Mary, they went totally back to Roman Catholicism. So then, of course, comes Elizabeth I in 1558. And under her is when Anglicanism actually begins to be defined. And Elizabeth is part of that. She refers to the church using the words via media, that the middle way, that we're going to find a way to steer this church so that it's not just Roman Catholic and it's not just Protestant, but we're going to find a way to live into both of these things. So she says we're going to keep the liturgy in the church, but it's going to be in the vernacular, it's going to be in English. And that's when all of this starts to form. The final break with Rome doesn't occur until 1570, when Rome totally breaks with England. So it doesn't officially happen until then. There are lots of battles in England then between all of these groups. But it's at this point that the church tries to define who it is. And the person who really does the most to make that happen is Richard Hooker. Richard Hooker is the from my perspective, is the centerpiece of Anglicanism and did more to define what it meant to be Anglican than anybody else. And I'll just quickly do the little symbolism that Hooker did to help define the church. And that was his image of a three-legged stool. And some of you have heard that terminology. But Hooker said the Anglican Church is a three-legged stool. And the three legs are Scripture, that Scripture is very, very important to us. And we're not ever going to let go of that. So from that standpoint, the church is very Protestant. Tradition, that tradition is just as important to us as Scripture, and we're going to go back to the whole communion of saints. In other words, we're not letting go of that ancient, what is then called Catholic tradition, okay? But the third leg that separates this church from other churches is reason. He says that reason is what makes somebody an Anglican. That we're going to hold on to the Scripture, we're going to hold on to the tradition, and we're going to think all this out. We're going to think about what we're doing and what that looks like and put it all together. And you can't have one without the other. And to this day, that remains the hallmark of Anglicanism. We're all about reasonably taking Scripture and tradition and figuring out how to put that together into one thing. It's all about balance. So what Hooker's saying is that Luther did some great things, but he went overboard, that he threw out the baby with the bathwater, and the Catholic Church definitely needed to be reformed, but we need to do all of that together, okay? And to this day, that's what this church is supposed to be all about. That's why it's so bizarre, I don't want to get too far off on this, with the church in Africa now, the Anglican Church in Africa, that has a very hierarchical set of folks in the church, which is the opposite of what we're supposed to be in England, and that's because of the influence of the Catholic folks there. But we have more Anglicans now. We have more Anglicans that are people of color than we do Western Europeans now. We have way more Anglicans in Africa than we do in Western Europe. So the church is really changing in lots of ways, and we'll talk about that more in later classes, okay? Everybody all right so far? Okay. So after that, England falls into civil war in the 1600s. We have the Puritan influence in the church, and they win the day in the 1600s, and the episcopacy in England is abolished. The Puritans take over, and the Church of England ceases to exist again in the 1600s. The Puritan movement in the church is not popular because it's a despotic movement, and that never goes over well, as we talked about this morning. And the extremes on either side never held for very long in England. There were popular movements on both sides, but they never lasted very long. And think about British people a little bit, and you can understand why that would be. Anybody who's on any side of the extremes, that's not going to work very long. So the Puritans didn't last long, and as you know, they gave up, and some of them came to America to do something else. So by 1660, the Anglican Church is back in England, and they write another prayer book in 1662 to do that. Okay? To this day, the 1662 prayer book is still the official prayer book in England. So I'm struggling here with 1979. They're using 1662, so I guess I should just be quiet. All right, good. So If Henry VIII formed the Anglican Church, I'm not sure I understand how anybody could possibly believe that, looking at what happened in history. The church was totally back to Roman Catholicism after him, and his break was only a political break to put him in a good situation. He was a Catholic through and through. So I never got that. Elizabeth I is the real person around where Anglicanism formed, okay? I think that's the most important part of that. So let's go to America. So we talked a little bit about the Puritans. Are they the first folks to come to America with a religious tradition? When was the Mayflower? Somebody knows the Mayflowers? 16. You guys are close. 1620. Yep. But remember that there was other ships that came here in 1607 to Jamestown, Virginia. And they were not Puritans. They were Church of England folks. So the first denomination to arrive in America was Church of England, was Anglicans. That Church of England that comes to America is very low church. Do you all know what I mean by low church and high church? I see some heads shaking. Let's do that quickly. So I don't want to confuse it too much with the way we talk about it today, but low church means you have less accoutrements in the church. In some low churches, clergy don't wear vestments at all. You can't even see my collar. And really, as we call them, snake belly low churches, you can't tell the difference between the clergy person and anybody else in the church. The term Mr. is used for male clergy. The Eucharist is not done terribly often in really low churches. And it's just a more informal style of worship, okay? As opposed to high church, where you have all of the smells and bells, every smell and bell that you can think of, and you build totally around that. And those are just different approaches to liturgy in the church. So here, I don't want to get too much into today because we're going to do that later, but like in the Diocese of Arizona, we have high churches would be like St. Michael's, which has incense and lots of bells throughout the service. St. Philip's is a very high church now, as opposed to what it was a few years ago. Some of those churches today are called Anglo-Catholic, meaning that they're very Catholic in liturgical nature, okay, and a mix there. So the whole point I'm trying to make here is the church that came to America was low church. They had morning and evening prayer as the regular service. Attendance at those services was required daily. You got 2 sermons on Sunday. Communion happened about every quarter, about every 3 months you would have a communion service, okay? So just to give you a feel for the way the church was then. Between 1607 and 1740, Jamestown, up until 1740, there was an explosive growth of Church of England in Virginia. The Virginia legislature actually passed a law that said no settler can live more than 6 miles from a church. It was actually a law in Virginia that you couldn't do that. By 1671, there were 48 parishes in Virginia. A lot of those churches still exist today. You can go see them all. After 1700, there were more and more clergy educated in America. Most of them came from one institution. Anybody know? Thank you very much. The William and Mary is our Anglican institution. So from 1723 to 1776, most of our clergy were educated at William and Mary. Education is very important in the Anglican and Episcopal tradition. It's one of the hallmarks of our tradition. And in America, that became even more so. The clergy in America actually were better trained than their English counterparts. So that's always been a major part of the American Episcopal Church, for better or for worse. But I think it's important for you to know that, okay? So up to the Revolution, almost all Virginians belonged to the Church of England. I mean, well over 90%. So there were 107 parishes at that point, and 30 years later, there were 35. What happened? What was happening in history then, in 1776? Yeah. So it's really hard to be an Anglican in America when we were at war with England. And so the church really, really struggled at that time. This was also the rise of deism in the male aristocracy, and that also contributed to decline in the church. Anybody know about deism? Just quickly, Tess? Where's that microphone?
My brief understanding about deism, based on what I read up on, is that deism is believing in God or in a supreme being without being rooted into any type of particular religious practice or any particular faith tradition. It's like basically being spiritual, but without any of the religious aspects.
Yep, that's a pretty modern day understanding of deism, absolutely. Deism is also, I'd call it the forerunner of secular humanism, okay? It's the understanding that the image of God as the great clockmaker who makes the clock and then stands back and lets it all run, lets the world go on its own. It's a very common sense understanding. And the majority of the founding fathers of this country were deists. That's why I always love it when I hear fundamentalists say we need to go back to the church of our forefathers. They were deists. I really don't think that's the church they want. And so deists were obviously big in the Anglican tradition. So for example, George Washington was Anglican. Almost all of our founders were Anglican. But to give you an idea, George Washington went to church about once a month. And he found that important, but no more than that. Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Jay, Patrick Henry, they were all Anglican. 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglican. They were also most likely deist. So that's our heritage. That's the American church's heritage. 45% of Virginia clergy were pro-patriot during the Revolutionary War. So it was about 50-50. And nearly all of the laity were pro-patriot. So you have to figure the clergy are doing this maybe to protect themselves and their jobs a little bit, but even then it was about 50-50, okay? So at the time of the Revolution, we had 250 buildings. We went down to 35 by 1810. James Madison, the Episcopal bishop at this time, was the second cousin to the president, James Madison. So that's to give you some feel for what's going on there in the country. In New England, by 1700, there are more Congregationalists than any other tradition. Anglicans were second, and there were Anglican churches from Massachusetts to South Carolina, okay? But the Anglican Church here is forming way differently than it is in England. First of all, because America is pluralistic very, very quickly, it's affecting how the church is forming. The Church of England is in every colony by the Revolution, and the church is characterized here very differently than England by lay rule. Lay people are basically running churches because how are we going to get any clergy people to do this? So that early emphasis on lay people really affected the church and has to this day. And thank you, Jesus. The laity have much more authority here, even to this day, than they do in England. And I think that has a lot to do with our history and our upbringing there. And that became a major part of what we would be as a church and still are today. All right. So the church struggled through, obviously, the revolution and all of that, but the church did survive okay. And one of the things that pushed the church in that direction was the SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. That ministry and that evangelical approach to what we were doing made a big influence on the church here and also in England and Wales. John Wesley was an SPG missionary, to give you an idea. You know, John Wesley was Anglican. Okay. So there were two factors in the church decline. Obviously, the ties to England during the Revolution, and then one other event in history really affected the Episcopal Church, and that was the Great Awakening. I don't know how much you know about the Great Awakening. That was the movement in the church that involved a conversion of the heart. It was very extemporaneous. Liturgies were very extemporaneous. There was no decorum. It was all about enthusiasm. Think of a Pentecostal church today, that kind of feeling. It was, as my former teacher, Mary June Nestler, used to tell me, it was classic Protestant doctrine in enthusiastic clothes. And I think that's a good way to talk about that. Tess?
My question is it safe to say or even ask if the Episcopalian Church had resulted from the combination of both deism and Anglicism?
Yes. Deism played a major influence on what the Anglican Church became, for sure, as did the whole Anglican tradition. So you can see why the Great Awakening did not fit well with what the church was. The Great Awakening very much appealed to folks with less education. So the Church of England actually started becoming even more the church of the educated and the elite in America because of that split with the Great Awakening. So we were very much that kind of church. This Great Awakening was a purely American movement. This was not happening in the rest of the world. And I would say that the roots of American fundamentalism come out of the Great Awakening. And I think this is really important to understand. American fundamentalism started growing in the very early 20th century. I would say the beginning of it was probably the Azusa Street revival in California. And American fundamentalism is really doesn't start until then. So I'm always troubled by folks who say that they want to recapture that kind of church, to go back to the old days of the church. The old days was the church that you just described, Tess. So moving on from that, So at this point, the church still doesn't have a bishop. And now, of course, the British aren't visiting us anymore. So the Anglican Church has trouble on that front, too. And we started envisioning what the Episcopal Church would be without any ties, obviously, to England, but to have no government ties at all. So the folks putting together the church met in Maryland in 1780, and they formed what we called the Protestant Episcopal Church, and that was the original name of the church. The first General Convention was in Philadelphia in 1789, and we set up principles for that church not linked to the government. And basically, we'll talk about this next week when we talk about the prayer book. But what we basically did is take the prayer book and cross out king everywhere and write people, and went from there. So at that General Convention in Philadelphia, in Christ Church in Philadelphia, if you've been there, right down the street from where the American democracy was formed, we put together the church. And about half of the folks that were at the forming of the Constitutional Convention of America literally walked down the street to Christ Church and sat down and formed the Episcopal Church. So if you think the Episcopal Church sounds like its polity, and we're going to have a whole session on polity, is like America, it's because it's the same people that formed the church. We're very much the same kind of organization. So at that time, they affirmed a threefold ministry, that we would have deacons, priests, and bishops. But that we would be democratic in the way we ran the church, with clergy and laity doing everything. So the idea here was to do the same thing, to hold on to the ancient tradition, what was then Catholic, and then create this democratic church with clergy and laity running it, much more Protestant. In fact, the church set it up so that it required lay participation in the church, very different than any other church. That's another major thing that separates us. That's probably the biggest contribution of the Episcopal Church in America to the entire Anglican communion in the world. Now, the church in England is like that. I mean, they require lay participation too. So that all came from us. Our polity, I think, is our great gift to the whole Anglican communion. So how are we doing here? All right. So now we need a bishop. What do we do? What we do is say we're going to elect someone to be a bishop, and that is another hallmark of the Anglican Church in America. Bishops are not appointed. From the very, very beginning, the first time, we elected our bishops. So we elected Samuel Seabury to be the first bishop, and he had to go get, in that apostolic succession thing we talked about, he has to go somewhere to have 3 bishops lay their hands on his head to ordain him a bishop. So he does that by going to Scotland. Obviously, we can't go to England, so he goes to Scotland and is ordained by, quote, non-juring bishops. So let me tell you a little bit about non-juring bishops. Non-juring bishops were the bishops in England that left England during the Reformation because they were in trouble of getting their heads cut off. So they went to Scotland. So those are the folks that ordained our first bishop, Samuel Seabury. And so our roots are actually come from the Scottish Episcopal Church as opposed to England. And I like to honor that in the church here. You might have noticed if you look really closely, at our bulletin today, the second half of our Eucharistic prayer is a Scottish Eucharistic prayer. And the whole reason I do that is to remind you all that our roots come from Scotland. So, to be a bishop in the Church of England, you had to take an oath to the king. So all those folks that said, I'm not doing that, those are the folks that became the non-jurors. Okay, very good. So from the very beginning, the American Episcopal Church has kind of been countercultural, I would say, from that perspective. So 1789 was our first prayer book. We wrote another one in 1892. That was the first prayer book to allow prayers for the dead. In 1928, we wrote our next prayer book, which was much more ecumenical in its approach. And then the prayer book that we're still using is 1979. And the biggest thing in the 1979 prayer book was communion became our central act of worship, and there's a whole new theology of baptism, which is much more like what we talked about last week in the Eastern Church. So there we go. Okay. So the church was dying off post-revolution. There were, by that point, 10,000 Episcopalians out of 4 million Americans. The nation is rural, and our church is very urban. So by 1825, we were quite depleted and in dire straits. And what revived the church was that evangelical movement that I talked about, and mission. We were all about mission out into the whole world and establishing ourselves everywhere. People like John Henry Hobart, Jackson Kemper, they worked really hard to grow the church from a mission standpoint and evangelically. Absalom Jones became the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of that later. But we became very involved in the in the ecumenical movement throughout the church, the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, and lots of other movements when churches work together to build stuff. So that was the first thing that really revived the church, and the other was and the Oxford movement. Does anybody know about the Oxford movement? The Oxford movement was a liturgical movement in the church. And remember that the church that came to America was very low church, and the Oxford movement came and brought back a lot of the accoutrements to church. So there was this movement to recover that part of the ancient tradition and bring the candles back and the stained glass and all of that. And that really helped the church a lot. I'm talking about the latter half of the 19th century. But the thing that really shot the church up in number of people was our social action. Social action became the centerpiece of the church. And that came also out of the Oxford movement. Women who basically became the social gospel in the church, groups like the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society, if you've heard of them, all of that really helped to grow the church. A guy named Charles Henry Brent did all these inner city missions in Boston. He started the idea of interchurch cooperation, which led to the ecumenical movement in 1927, the World Conference on Faith and Order. So those three things is really what built the church. Foreign mission, ecumenical cooperation with other churches, and our social witness. And to this day, what does Great St. Paul say? Earth justice, migrant justice, social justice. So, I mean, that's still in many ways what we're all about. Let's see, how we doing here? Okay, we're good. Schooling also became an important part of the church. Hannah More, Julia Chester Emery, I don't know if you ever heard any of those names. Growing up in Maryland, we had the Hannah More Academy down the street from us. Those women were very important in getting kids into school and educating people again. So by the beginning of the 20th century, the church moved from what appeared to be certain death from the separation from England and the Revolution to becoming a really integral part of American life. And some folks will begin to see it as the most important American church. Certainly, it was not the biggest church, but many people started seeing it as the most important. In those days in the church, again, most members of Congress were members of the Episcopal Church, and we'll talk more about that too. But the church really became big on the national scene. Then two other major events in the world right before that affected all of this, affected every church in the world. And that was in 1859, this Anglican deacon in the church named Charles Darwin wrote this little book called The Origin of the Species. It's really hard to tell you how upsetting that was to church people. There were riots in the streets over that book. I mean, it was just crazy. And the other major event was biblical criticism, which began in Germany. Biblical criticism is the whole idea that we're going to look at the Bible as a book and study it like we would any other book, put it in context of where it came from, and look at it as a piece of literature and understand it from that standpoint. Those two things changed the face of religion in the whole world. Most churches fought against those things tooth and nail and saw it as a direct attack on faith and their own faith. But Anglicanism handles both and actually adopts them. And of course, Charles Darwin was an Anglican to begin with. But that is another hallmark of this church. From the very beginning, we adopted the origin of species and understood that as not an issue to our faith on any front. And we started looking at the Bible from a more critical standpoint too. And that very much formed the Episcopal Church in many ways, while a lot of other churches were fighting that. In the Civil War, the Episcopal Church was the only church in America that did not split in half, for better or for worse. And we can talk about which one that is. But every other denomination split in half. So the Baptist Church became the Southern Baptist and the American Baptist Church. The Presbyterian Church became what is now the USA and the PCA Church. Every denomination split in half, except the Episcopalians, and somehow we stayed together. And we can argue about whether that was a good thing or not, but we're not going to do that today. But the church truly became a national church. And I don't think there's any question about that. In 1946, we had our first full-time national leader. Henry Knox Sherrill became the presiding bishop. And because the church was so big and national at that point, that was Sherrill's only job, was to run the church. Before that, we had a presiding bishop, but they just did it with the other parts of their job. And in 1946, that became impossible. He also served as the first president of the National Council of Churches. So you see, again, our ecumenism there, and the World Council of Churches. And he was determined to bring more unity to American Christians. And the church thrived during that time. From 1946 to 1960 became the period of greatest growth in the Episcopal Church. We grew leaps and bounds during that time for all of those reasons. And then that stopped. Anybody want to take a guess why the church stopped growing in 1960? A church made up of both people in the North and the South from the Civil War? Yeah, the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement stopped growth in the Episcopal Church in lots of ways. And the second thing was the role of women in the church. Obviously, we stood up for women having a major role in the church, and that did too. And we took a major stand in the civil rights movement, and Southern churches just left the denomination in whole groups. So there you go. The church spent a lot of time addressing issues of Black Americans. Debbie, yep, grab that microphone. Thank you.
The church started reconsidering the role of women. Did I hear you right?
Yep.
Okay. So was that a result of the women's movement at that time, with all the other movements arising, or do you think that the church would have come to that conclusion anyway?
Because we were so involved in the civil rights movement, we became very involved in the women's movement. Which one came first, I would have difficulty saying. But it was definitely
on the radar of the church to consider women's roles until the movements.
And we were late. We were late to the game for sure. Absolutely. So remember, I guess this is next week, but our first women priests weren't ordained until 1976. So 1974, and then they were approved in 1976. The Philadelphia 11 was 74. That was pretty darn late to the game to be doing this. But we still had people leaving the church over that issue.
Was it the same thing for gays?
Yeah, so the same thing happened, and we're going to talk about that in later classes too. The same thing happened when we embraced the LGBTQ community, and again, we were very late to the game. We weren't marrying same-sex couples. That wasn't approved until 3 years ago? Well, I've been doing this for 10 years, but the church, and that's how we change things in the church, and we're going to talk about that next week. But that's how we change things in the Episcopal Church. It's always a root movement from the bottom. It's always grassroots, and we just start doing it. So we ordained our first women priests in 1974, and we dragged the church along in 1976 when the rest of the church actually approved what we're doing. Some of us did the same thing in the LGBTQ community. I just started doing marriages, and there were a few other of us doing that, and eventually the church came around. That's how we change things in this church. Very, very different from other churches. Okay? All right. Okay, so on that front, let me quote John Hines on that before I let this go. He said, "We will consciously devote," the presiding bishop in 1960, "we will consciously devote our efforts to Black concerns in this church." And when he said that, they just left in droves. So women was the next issue. We didn't have women on vestries until the 1960s. I mean, yeah, seriously. The first women to vote at General Convention was 1970, I am embarrassed to say. And then Philadelphia 11 was 1974. By the way, Rosanna Kazanjian, I don't know how any of you know Rosanna. She preached at our wedding, and she's an affiliate priest here, but she's in her 80s now. She was in the second rung of women to get ordained in the church. So if you ever want to talk to somebody about that, Rosanna's great. Okay. So yeah, okay, so we did that. In 1980, the Episcopal Church was voted in one of those questionnaire things that the Pew Research folks do as the most progressive of 23 religions on the question of racial justice. In 1985, our new presiding bishop, Edmund Browning, said there will be no outcasts in this church, and diversity became our strength. Very interestingly, in 1991, Episcopalian George Bush, preparing for war with Iraq, went to Edmund Browning and asked him about this, and Browning told him to reconsider going to war with them. That's back in the days when people were listening to us. So that's where we are. And that's who we become as a church. We're obviously we're open to all. We're accepting of all across the wide range of theology. Most of you know the story of Gene Robinson, who was the first openly gay person to be ordained a bishop in this church. And we've come a long, long way from where we are, but that is still central to what we're all about. We're going to talk a little bit in other classes about how we connect with the whole Anglican Church, but you hear how the Episcopal Church grew differently than the church in England. And when we sent our missionaries out from America, we were the folks that started missions in many places in the world, including Asia and Latin America. So the Anglican Church that grew out of that came mostly from America, not from England. And we can talk more about that in later sessions. But what holds us together, the entire Anglican Church, is what we call bonds of affection, meaning that there is no polity between us or theology among us that we all have to agree upon or anything like that. We just hold each other together in these bonds of affection. So it's not about theology at that level. Okay? All right, lay it on me. What are your questions? Tess? Okay, let's start over here, Tess, and we'll get John and then.
Well, I'm a Catholic, and you mentioned earlier about praying for the dead. I mean, I grew up with that's something you did every day, and
yes,
you pray for your parents, your grandparents, your brother, your sister. Yes. Could you speak how? And I've noticed, and I have a lot of other friends in other faiths, and they don't consider that.
Right.
To me, it's like, well, why don't you?
Right.
I don't understand why you don't. So can you tell me?
Yeah. I don't know if I can tell you, but I can tell you where that comes from. Yeah. Okay. So that was part of the Reformation movement, and it was tied to a lot of this indulgence stuff, that the church was having somebody pay a clergy person to do a votive mass for the dead, for somebody in your family who had died, so that person could be saved. So in the Reformation, when indulgences, when folks like Luther were saying that all of that stuff was bad because of indulgences, that we were paying somebody off to pay for somebody who had died, all of that went out with the bathwater. So the idea that we would pray for dead people was immediately tied to indulgences, and people said, this is totally untoward. Why in the world would we do that? And why in the world would we say that by us praying that it's going to help this person be saved? It goes back to the idea of purgatory and that whole notion that that people are stuck in purgatory and we need to do these indulgences to get them out. So that left a really bad taste in people's mouth about praying for the dead, and that's how it got separated out. And the Anglican Church was in that boat too for a long time, and it wasn't until 1928 that we started doing that again on a regular basis, when we separated it from the indulgence thing and said, well, of course we're going to pray for the dead. But that's where it came from. Does that? Yeah, we pray for the dead every week, right? In the prayers of the people? Yep, every single week. Yep, absolutely. But it took a long time to get there after the Reformation.
Hi.
Hey.
I was just wondering, when you mentioned that the Episcopal Church was a little late in coming to the civil rights or the women's rights, could you shed some perspective on that? I was coming from a fairly conservative Catholic background.
Yes.
There was never any talk of that in my church.
Yeah, of course, that's all a matter of perspective, where you're coming from. And I didn't mean to say, if I did, that they were late to the civil rights movement. We weren't late to civil rights. We were quick on that boat. But it took us a long time in looking at the culture for us to get to the place where women had the same role in the church as men. 1974 was the Philadelphia 11, so there were other churches that definitely beat us to that place. Not the Roman Church, of course, who still isn't there, but there were other churches that got there faster than we did. And from my perspective, the reason I said it's late to the game is because I believe we should have been doing this in the 19th century. So from my perspective, it was very late. Same thing with LGBTQ issues. We got there, but it took many of us in the grassroots pulling the church along, which is okay, and at least we change. So does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Leo?
Can you talk a little bit about the decision-making process? What happens at General Convention for change to come about?
Yeah, we're gonna have a whole class on that, how we do it. But let me just quickly, so the class we have on polity, that's what we're gonna talk about, how we make those decisions. But let me just quickly say that we have a General Convention that meets every 3 years. And the General Convention, it looks just like the American government. We have a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. And the House of Bishops is made up of all of the bishops, living bishops in the church. There's some debate about that right now, but at the moment, that's what it is. And the House of Deputies is half lay people and half clergy. And they're all elected in their individual dioceses to go. And then we vote on everything. And it's like the Senate and the House of Representatives in the American government. So it has to pass both houses to go through, except we don't have a president to do anything. Our presiding bishop has no more power than any other bishop, or any other layperson for that matter. So we just vote on everything. So we work on resolutions throughout the 3 years before that for things to vote on. We have committees for liturgy and music, for social justice issues, for everything in the church. And then these resolutions come to the table and we just vote on them one by one. And that goes for everything that we do in the church. We vote to make a decision. Nobody can tell us what to believe or what to think. There's a meeting, the Lambeth Conference, which we'll talk about in other weeks, where all the bishops in all the Anglican Church get together and they pass resolutions, but none of them have any effect on us other than to say, well, that's nice of them to say. But everything that we do in the church, we vote on to make a decision on. Does that answer where you're going? Yep. Yep.
Thank you.
Just a quick point, that it seems to me like sitting here and hearing about all these changes and how this has been going on forever.
Yep.
We're still sitting in all those things today now, too. I think it was it just 3 years ago, maybe? It was St. Francis in the Hills. Is that, that's not Lutheran, that is...
Methodist.
Methodist, thank you.
Yep.
Yes, Methodist.
Yep.
And I remember that pastor talking so much about I don't know if it was an annual every 3-year gathering overall, and how disappointing and anger that was built up about a vote within that church to
Right.
really include LGBTQ+.
Yep.
And it looked like for a long time there, I didn't keep up with it, but that it was going to potentially tear that church apart too.
It has.
It has.
It has. It has split the Methodist Church in half again. So they are in the middle of separating right now.
Yeah, so these are all these things we talk about that you point out all the history for.
Yep.
It keeps on being our fights. And I think in the Catholic Church, of course, certainly about the role of women.
Right.
All of that is a huge issue, of course, there too.
Right.
But it's still all real.
Absolutely, it's all real. You're not kidding. Yep. Yep. Every single day. Yep.
I grew up Catholic too, and maybe I don't know what the plenary prayer that
A plenary indulgence?
indulgence that you
Gosh, you
said.
missed them?
I don't
Lucky
know
you.
what they maybe
Lucky
I don't
you.
know what they are. I went to Catholic school. I have no idea.
Okay, good. Maybe, that makes me think that maybe they put the plenary indulgence to bed after I left the church.
Or
Anyway, a plenary indulgence, the idea is that if you say this one prayer over a certain amount of time or something, that your loved one will immediately go to heaven, or you can do it for yourself. It's plenary because you do this the one time and then you're saved forever. It's not terribly different than in a fundamentalist tradition where somebody says, if you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, except you do this prayer to do that.
would it be like a rosary funeral
Yeah.
service or something?
Yeah. There was an actual prayer when I was in the church that was called a plenary indulgence.
Okay.
But it usually involved a rosary or some sort of vigil. Yeah. But I don't want to speak for the Roman Church either, so, and I pray to God that that's dead, but, so I hope maybe you never experience it because it didn't exist anymore, I hope.
I've recently been to a rosary, at a,
Yeah,
you know, a
yeah.
rosary at a viewing.
Yep. Go ahead, Leo, did you have another one?
That's all right. Please, you first.
So I'm just curious to know, Father Steve, how much more different is the Anglican church or tradition versus the modern Episcopalian? And I believe you touched up on some of those differences earlier when you were speaking.
You mean the Church of England now as opposed to us?
Right, like because I mean, I understand that we're still Anglican, right? But
Right.
we're a different kind of Anglican from the Church of England, right?
Well, like I said, what holds us together are bonds of affection. So all of us have different polity and different ways that we organize the church. But they are our sister churches. It's difficult to say anything across the board. For one thing, we have a different prayer book. So our liturgy is quite different in America than it is in England. Not quite. I mean, we follow the same order of worship, but that in itself makes us different. And our theology is different too. But this is a broad church. Whether we're talking about the whole Anglican Church or just the Episcopal Church, this is a big tent. We have very, very conservative people in this church and very progressive people and everything in between. For better or worse, we've tried to stay big tent all the time. And I'm really grateful when we have people from both sides of that theology around us. So it's really difficult to say how we're different other than those things, than the Book of Common Prayer.
Okay, what I've also noticed is that as I was driving around Tucson, I've noticed that there's more Episcopal churches and there's only like 2 Anglican churches here in town.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up. We'll talk about that too. So the Episcopal Church is the American Episcopal Church. That's who we are. And as you just said, we're all Anglicans. But what's happened is the churches in America that have been part of the fight and aren't willing to be with us on all of those things we voted on, women priests, gay priests, everybody welcome to the community, all of those issues, the churches that could not go along with that did not believe that was biblical, they decided to leave the church, the Episcopal Church. So what they did was most of them affiliated with a church that had the same belief system they did. So most of them chose to affiliate with an African church that was very, very conservative on these issues and did not welcome any of those folks into their community. So they are actually part of a diocese in Africa. And so they're calling themselves an Anglican church because they are an Anglican church. They're part of the big, wide church, but they're not in the Episcopal tradition at all anymore.
So we would be called like the liberal Anglican branch of Christianity, maybe.
Yeah, nope. So the Episcopal Church is the Episcopal Church, and we're all of those things. And folks that can't live with the way we've organized the church and our theology, they need to leave. And
Okay.
that's what they did. They left.
I think you mostly just answered my question, but I was wondering if there were also those who still call themselves Episcopals but did not accept LGBTQ people and...
Yeah, absolutely. Most of those folks have left the tradition now. And that's over many general conventions where we came together and tried to come up with a way to keep everybody in the same tent. But in the last 12 years, in the last 4 general conventions, we brought things to the table because many of us could not continue to be in a church where we were not accepting of every person. So it became crucial to us that we be in a church where everybody was treated the same way and was held with the same dignity and respect. So we voted on all of those things at General Convention, and we knew that there were going to be groups that weren't going to agree with this, and we held them in prayer, and we worshiped together with them before that, but then we had to vote, and we voted, and we said this is what we believe in as a church, and this is what we have to be. That's who we are as children of God and as the Jesus Church. So we did that, and at that point, most of those folks left. But not all. There are still, you can still find some Episcopalians who don't even want women to be priests, for sure.
And one more quick question. What is the next big issue?
Wow, that's a really difficult question, and we're going to talk about that in our last session, for sure, because I want to get all your feelings about that too. One is ecumenism. Are we at a place in the church where it still makes sense to be Episcopalian? So, for example, I have clergy colleagues. I'll tell you flat out, I have clergy colleagues that aren't Episcopalian, that come from other traditions. I meet with a group of Mennonites, Presbyterian USA folks, Lutheran ELCA folks, some UCC folks, some Disciples of Christ folks, and all of us are in general agreement about all of those social justice issues. So are we at the place where we should be all together? And if so, what does that look like? I think that's one of the major issues that we're going to have in the church. Beyond that, I think it's the way that we do church is going to be the biggest issue. This church, Grace St. Paul's, is going to be very active in making this church a national church, so that people that are now live streaming across the country watching us can become part of this church in that form. And I imagine that church from that perspective is going to change tremendously in the next 20 years. And I hope that we're on the forefront of that movement. I'm expecting more of that kind of change in the church than I am social justice issues. But I could be wrong about that. Yep. Yep.
Thank you. I had a question when you were talking about all of the people over some of the social issues leaving.
Yeah.
Was there movement the other way of some coming in because of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I talked about last week the fact that 70% of Episcopalians come from another tradition or no tradition at all. That's what this church is all about. And that's how we grow. And certainly Grace St. Paul's is definitely like that. We have even more people coming from the outside than other traditions. But the church absolutely grew from that direction. Thanks for bringing that up. Yep. Yep. You know, and those are hard decisions to make because you love everybody and you want to hold everybody under the big tent. But I also personally cannot continue to be in a church that is not caring for every sick person with the same dignity and respect. I just can't do it. So, and that's why I made the decisions I did to do the stuff that I did. The other reason that I'm Episcopalian is because you can change this church in your lifetime. It was so difficult being in the Roman Catholic tradition where it takes 500 years to make the smallest little change and all of this stuff. We live in a world now where you can't wait that long to change things. You just can't do it. So that's another great thing about this church. All of our creation liturgies here at Grace St. Paul's, that couldn't happen in another tradition like that. And I am so grateful that in 15 years, we've created a season of creation in the entire Episcopal Church. In 15 years, that's a really short time in the big scheme of things. So that's really important to me too. Good? Thank you all. Thank you. So next week is Book of Common Prayer and Liturgy, right? Yep, okay. So prayer book and liturgy. And that'll be a fun class too. Thank you all.